Look at that shadow. It's magnificent, isn't it? A sprawling, cross-hatched silhouette of galvanized steel that stretches exactly 74 feet across the immaculately manicured, chemically dependent Kentucky bluegrass of my neighbor's front lawn. Every afternoon at exactly 3:15 p.m., the sun dips just low enough to cast the unmistakable shape of a massive broadcast tower directly over his pristine bay windows, plunging his living room into a cage of darkness. I like to sit on my porch with an iced tea and just watch it happen. But to really appreciate the beauty of this 70-ton middle finger, we have to go back to the beginning. Meridian, Idaho, is a place where dreams of suburban perfection go to ossify. It's the kind of neighborhood where people measure their grass with a ruler and report you if your trash cans are visible for more than 12 seconds after the garbage truck leaves. And ruling over this sterile utopia was Richard Sterling. Everyone called him Dick. It was less of a nickname and more of a terrifyingly accurate character assessment. Dick was the HOA President. He wore khakis that were ironed so sharply they could cut glass, polo shirts tucked in with military precision, and he always carried this stupid, rigid iron clipboard. That clipboard was the source of all my misery until it became the catalyst for his. It all started over a piece of plastic and metal no bigger than a dinner plate. I had just moved in a few months prior. I'm a simple guy. I like watching local football, and I hate paying $80 a month for cable when an HD antenna can pull the same channels out of thin air for free. So, I bought a standard, basic digital antenna. It was sleek, barely noticeable, and I mounted it right to the side of my chimney. You couldn't even see it from the street unless you parked your car, walked up my driveway, stood in my flowerbed, and squinted at an upward 45-degree angle, which is exactly what Dick did. I was sitting in my kitchen on a Saturday morning, sipping my coffee, when I saw the top of a bald head bobbing outside my window. I walked to the glass, and there was Dick, tramping right through my hydrangeas, holding his iron clipboard and pointing a pen at my roof like it was an incoming missile. I opened the front door. "Can I help you, Richard? Or are we just aggressively admiring the masonry today?" He didn't even look at me. He just kept scribbling on his clipboard. Section 4, Paragraph B, Subsection 2 of the Covenant's Conditions and Restrictions. No external antennas, satellite dishes, or signal receivers of any kind are permitted without prior written authorization from the Architectural Review Committee. "Dick, it's a TV antenna," I said, leaning against the doorframe. "It's literally the size of a frisbee. I'm just trying to watch the Boise State game." He finally turned to me, his eyes dead and devoid of any human joy. "The rules are the rules. Your aesthetic non-compliance degrades the property values of the entire subdivision. I am issuing you a formal warning. You have 24 hours to remove the offending structure, or you will be fined $500. $500? I laughed, thinking he had to be joking. He wasn't. "Dick, the FCC literally says you can't ban TV antennas. There's a federal law about this. It's called the OTARD rule, over-the-air reception devices. Look it up." Dick sneered. "The federal government does not dictate the visual standards of the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association. I dictate them. 24 hours. He slapped a neon green piece of paper on my front door, turned on his heel, and marched away. I was annoyed, sure, but I wasn't going to let some neighborhood tyrant bully me. I went back inside, printed out the exact FCC guidelines highlighting the fact that HOAs cannot legally restrict basic television antennas, and emailed it to the official HOA board address with a polite but firm note explaining why his fine was invalid. I figured that would be the end of it. Bureaucrats love paper, right? I gave him the paper. I was so incredibly wrong. 3 days later, I came home from work. The neon green sticker was gone from my door. I looked up at the chimney. The antenna was gone. My blood ran cold. I walked around the side of the house and found the antenna smashed into pieces in my recycling bin. The coaxial cable had been snipped with wire cutters. Someone had dragged a ladder onto my property, climbed up onto my roof, and physically destroyed my property. I didn't even go inside. I marched straight down the street to Dick's house. I hammered on his door until my knuckles hurt. He opened it, holding a glass of white wine, looking thoroughly unbothered. "If this is about the noise ordinance, I am well within my rights to—" "Did you climb onto my roof and rip down my antenna?" I demanded, stepping into his personal space. "I abated a nuisance," Dick said, taking a smug sip of his wine. "You ignored a formal directive from the board. The CC&Rs give the HOA the right to remedy violations at the homeowner's expense. Expect a bill for the ladder rental." "You trespassed on my property and vandalized my house," I yelled. "I protected the neighborhood," he replied coolly. "And if you put another one up, I'll take that one down too. And I'll fine you $1,000 for repeat offenses. Keep pushing, and we will put a lien on your house and foreclose on it. Don't test me, boy." He slammed the door in my face. I stood there on his perfect porch, shaking with a rage so pure it felt like electricity. He didn't just cross a line, he obliterated it. I didn't want my $70 antenna back. I didn't want an apology. I wanted to break his spirit. I wanted to find a legal hammer so massive, so undeniably federal, that his little iron clipboard would crumple under the weight of it. I went home, booted up my computer, and didn't sleep for 2 days. I dove deep into the abyss of property law, municipal codes, and telecommunications regulations. I read the Whispering Pines bylaws front to back. Dick was right about one thing. The CC&Rs were ruthlessly strict. They controlled paint colors, mailboxes, the exact species of trees you could plant, but they had a massive, glaring blind spot. They were written in 1998 and completely ignored modern federal supremacy clauses. Then I found it. The holy grail of malicious compliance. The FCC's OTARD rule didn't just cover small TV antennas anymore. In 2021, the FCC updated the rule 47 CFR Source 1.4000 to keep up with modern technology. The update specifically prohibited HOAs, local zoning boards, and municipal governments from restricting antennas and structures used as relay hubs for fixed wireless internet service providers, or WISPs. Let me translate that from legal jargon into sweet, sweet revenge. If you are acting as a wireless internet node to beam internet to your neighbors, the HOA has absolutely zero legal authority to demand prior approval, cause delays, or issue bans on your equipment. None. Nada. Zero. Federal law completely preempts their stupid little neighborhood rules. I started making phone calls. I found a scrappy local WISP startup called Skylink Idaho. They were trying to expand their network, but couldn't afford to buy land to build towers. I called their CEO. "Hey," I said, "how would you like a free location for a relay node in the middle of Whispering Pines?" There was a pause on the line. "Are you kidding? The HOA there is legendary. They chased our installer out with a garden hose last year. We can't put anything up there." "You can if I lease you a patch of my backyard," I replied, grinning maniacally at my monitor. $1 a year? You provide the hardware, I provide the land. We claim federal protection under the 2021 OTARD revision. We blanket the neighborhood in cheap gigabit internet, and I get to build something very, very tall." "How tall are we talking?" the CEO asked, his voice tingling with sudden interest. "How tall can we legally go before the FAA requires those blinking red plane lights?" 200 feet. "Let's aim for a cool, conservative 100, I said. "Don't want to be greedy." We drafted a commercial lease agreement that night. By Wednesday, my backyard was officially registered as a critical telecommunications infrastructure hub. Then, I started pulling the municipal permits. Dick, in his infinite arrogance, had structured the HOA bylaws so that any major landscaping or construction required HOA approval unless it was mandated by state or federal utility laws. Because my project was now a federal utility project, I bypassed the HOA Architectural Review Committee entirely. I went straight to the city of Meridian. The city clerk took one look at my application for a 100-foot lattice steel broadcast tower in a residential backyard and almost laughed me out of the building. But I had my binder. I slapped down the 2021 FCC administrative order. I showed them the federal preemption clauses. I showed them that because the structure was under the 200-foot FAA limit, and because it was protected by the Telecommunications Act of 1996, the city literally could not deny the zoning permit without facing a massive federal lawsuit from the telecom company. The city lawyer looked it over, sighed heavily, and stamped it approved. The trap was set. Now I just needed to let Dick walk into it. I hired a contractor. His name was Michael, a 250-pound, heavily bearded guy who showed up in a pickup truck covered in mud and a t-shirt that said, "Will work for ammo." I liked him instantly. "So," Michael said, looking at the city permit in my kitchen, "you want me to pour a 10 by 10-foot, bunker-thick concrete footing in your backyard and then bolt a 100-foot steel tower to it?" "Exactly," I said. Michael scratched his beard. "This is an HOA neighborhood. They're going to have an aneurysm. That is the primary objective, yes." Michael grinned, revealing a missing bicuspid. "I hate HOAs. My sister lives in one. They fined her for having the wrong color mulch. Let's dig." The next morning at 6 a.m., the peaceful serenity of Whispering Pines was shattered by the roaring diesel engines of a miniature excavator and two massive cement mixers backing into my driveway. The backup alarms beeped incessantly. It sounded like an industrial loading dock. I was standing on my porch, drinking my coffee, watching Michael's crew tear a massive crater into my lawn. It was beautiful. It took exactly 14 minutes for Dick to show up. He came sprinting down the street, his bathrobe flapping in the wind, his iron clipboard clutched to his chest like a shield. His face was the color of a bruised plum. "Stop! Stop this immediately!" Dick shrieked, waving his arms at the excavator operator. The operator couldn't hear him over the engine and just gave him a friendly thumbs up before dumping a massive bucket of dirt onto the grass. Dick stormed over to me, spitting as he spoke. "What in the name of God is this? You do not have architectural approval for heavy machinery. You do not have approval for earth moving. I am fining you $10,000. I am calling the police. I am calling a tow truck." "Morning, Dick," I said, taking a sip of coffee. "I'm just following federal law." "Federal law does not permit you to turn your yard into a strip mine," he screamed. Michael walked over, wiping grease off his hands with a rag. He looked down at Dick, who was easily a foot shorter than him. "We got a problem here, boss?" Michael asked me. "No problem, Michael," I said. "Richard here was just admiring the slump of the concrete we're about to pour." "I am the president of this HOA," Dick yelled at Michael. "I order you to remove your vehicles from this property immediately, or you will be sued into bankruptcy." Michael just laughed, a deep, rumbling sound. "Buddy, the only thing I take orders from is the city permit stamped on the dashboard of my truck. Unless you're the building inspector, you need to step off an active construction site before you get hurt." Dick whipped out his phone, his hands shaking with fury. "That's it. I'm calling the police. You are both going to jail." "Make sure you tell them to bring someone who understands administrative law," I called out as Dick stormed back to the sidewalk, jabbing his finger into his phone screen. 20 minutes later, a Meridian PD cruiser rolled up. Officer Ramirez stepped out. He looked exhausted, like a man who had already dealt with 3 noise complaints and a loose dog before 7 a.m. Dick immediately accosted him. "Officer, thank God. Arrest this man. He is conducting illegal industrial construction. He is violating our CC&Rs. He is destroying the neighborhood." Officer Ramirez sighed and walked over to me. "Morning, sir. Can you tell me what's going on here? Mr. Sterling says you're building without permits." "I have every permit required by the city, county, and federal government, Officer Ramirez," I said calmly. I reached into my jacket and pulled out a fresh, laminated binder. I handed it to him. It was neatly tabbed. Federal preemption documents. Local contractor permits. WISP. Lease agreement. FCC Ruling 47, CFR Seocor 1.4000. Ramirez flipped open the binder. He read the first page. Then he read the second. He looked at the massive hole in my yard, then looked at the city stamp on the permits. He closed the binder and handed it back to me. He walked back to Dick. "Well?" Dick demanded. "Put him in cuffs." "Richard," Officer Ramirez said, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "This is a civil matter. And honestly, I've read his paperwork. It looks like he's outranking you. He has a federal telecom permit." "That's impossible," Dick sputtered. "We have rules, we have bylaws." "Your bylaws don't overrule the FCC, Dick," Ramirez said, getting back into his cruiser. "Stop calling us for this. If you have a problem, take it to court. Have a good day, gentlemen." The police car drove away. Dick stood there, his mouth opening and closing like a landed fish. He looked at me. He looked at Michael. He looked at the cement trucks pouring tons of thick, gray concrete into the earth. "You haven't won," Dick hissed, his voice dropping to a venomous whisper. "I will file an injunction. I will tie you up in litigation for the rest of your life." "You can try," I smiled. "But you might want to hurry. The crane gets here on Tuesday." The weekend between the concrete pour and the arrival of the tower was, to put it mildly, the most entertaining 48 hours of my entire life. You have to understand the psychology of a man like Richard Dick Sterling. He had built his entire identity around the illusion of absolute control. He was the king of Whispering Pines, a monarch ruling from a throne made of restrictive covenants and fine schedules. When Officer Ramirez drove away on Thursday morning, leaving Dick standing in front of a 10 by 10 foot, 3-foot deep slab of curing industrial concrete in my backyard, something inside the man simply snapped. He couldn't process the reality of being outranked. It was like watching a computer try to divide by zero. Friday morning, I woke up to find my front door plastered, and I mean literally wallpapered, with neon green HOA violation notices. There were 32 of them in total. I counted them while sipping my dark roast. He had cited me for everything imaginable. Unauthorized earthworks, unapproved aggregate materials, noise violations, eyesore creation, operating a commercial enterprise in a residential zone, parking unauthorized heavy equipment, which was hilarious considering Michael's crew had taken the cement trucks with them. He even cited me for malicious non-compliance with the spirit of the community, which sounded like something out of a dystopian novel. The total fines amounted to somewhere around $28,000. I carefully peeled them off, stacked them neatly, and threw them into the recycling bin. Then I went out back to check the slab. It was curing beautifully. Big Mike, my contractor, had told me to keep it slightly damp so it wouldn't crack under the Idaho sun. So I stood out there with my garden hose, lightly misting the concrete. Dick, of course, was watching me from his second-story bedroom window through a pair of high-end hunting binoculars. I know this because I could see the reflection of the sun glinting off the lenses. I smiled, raised the hose, and gave him a cheerful little wave. The binoculars violently jerked, and the blinds snapped shut. By Saturday afternoon, the neighborhood was practically humming with gossip. Whispering Pines was a quiet place. The most exciting thing that usually happened was someone putting out their recycling bins a day early. Now, there was a massive military-grade concrete bunker pad sitting in my backyard, and the HOA president was walking around looking like he was on the verge of a cardiac event. Neighbors I had never even spoken to started slow rolling past my house in their SUVs, staring at the yard. A woman named Susan from down the street, who was notorious for measuring people's hedges, actually stopped her golden retriever at the edge of my driveway and just stared at the concrete for a solid 5 minutes in total silence. Saturday night, Dick made his first desperate, tactical blunder. He called an emergency, mandatory HOA board meeting. He distributed the flyers by hand, aggressively shoving them into everyone's mailboxes. The meeting was scheduled for Sunday evening at the community clubhouse. The agenda read, in bold, capitalized, underlined text, "Emergency action regarding illegal industrial construction at 442 Oak Creek Drive." I arrived at the clubhouse at 6:55 p.m. for a 7 p.m. meeting. I didn't just walk in. I strolled. I was wearing cargo shorts, flip-flops, and a t-shirt that said FCC compliant. I also brought a foldable canvas camping chair and a literal bucket of popcorn. The clubhouse was packed. Every folding chair was taken. When I walked through the double doors, the room went dead silent. You could have heard a pin drop on the cheap commercial carpeting. Dick was standing at the front of the room behind a plastic folding table, flanked by the 2 other board members, a terrified-looking man named Gary, who always agreed with Dick, and a severe woman named Martha, who treated the HOA rulebook like a religious text. Dick's face instantly flushed a dark, violent crimson when he saw me. "You have a lot of nerve showing up here," he spat, pointing a trembling finger at me. "It's a mandatory meeting, Dick," I said loudly, unfolding my camping chair right in the center aisle, completely ignoring the empty seats in the back. I sat down, popped open a can of sparkling water, and grabbed a handful of popcorn. "I wouldn't want to get fined for missing it. Please, proceed. I'm excited to hear the presentation." Dick gripped the edges of the folding table so hard, his knuckles turned white. He addressed the room, his voice shaking with righteous indignation. "Residents of Whispering Pines, we are facing a crisis, an existential threat to our property values, our safety, and our way of life. The resident at 442 Oak Creek Drive has, without authorization, without architectural review, and without a shred of common decency, initiated the construction of an industrial-grade structure in his backyard." A murmur went through the crowd. Susan raised her hand. "Richard, what exactly is he building? It looks like a launch pad." "He claims," Dick sneered, putting massive air quotes around the word, "that he is building a telecommunications tower. He is attempting to bypass our sacred covenants by hiding behind federal loopholes. But I assure you, the HOA will not stand for this. We are currently pursuing emergency litigation. We will be seeking an immediate injunction to halt all construction, and we will be placing a lien on his property for the sum of $30,000 in accumulated fines." "Actually, Dick," I called out around a mouthful of popcorn, "it's a 100-foot lattice steel broadcast relay node for a fixed wireless internet service provider. And you can't place a lien on my house because under federal law, your fines are entirely invalid." "Silence!" Dick shrieked. "You do not have the floor." "I don't need the floor. I have the FCC," I replied, pulling my trusty binder out of my backpack. I stood up and turned to face the crowd of my neighbors. "Listen up, folks. How much are you all paying for internet right now? $80? $100? And it drops out every time it rains, right?" A few people in the crowd nodded hesitantly. "The structure going up in my yard on Tuesday is a WISP node," I explained, projecting my voice so everyone could hear. It's going to blanket this entire neighborhood in high-speed gigabit internet. The company, Skylink Idaho, is going to offer everyone within a 2-mile radius a flat rate of $40 a month. No contracts, no data caps. I'm not building an eyesore, I'm building modern infrastructure. And the best part? The Federal Communications Commission's 2021 OTARD revision expressly prohibits any HOA, including this one, from delaying, preventing, or restricting this exact type of installation. It's federal law. Dick's fines mean absolutely nothing. The room erupted. Half the people were yelling at Dick about their internet bills. The other half were yelling at me about property values. Martha was banging a wooden gavel on the folding table, screaming about the aesthetics of the neighborhood. Dick looked like he was about to spontaneously combust. I packed up my camping chair, tossed my popcorn bucket into the trash, and gave Dick a 2-finger salute. "See you Tuesday, Richard. Bring your hard hat." Monday was quiet. Too quiet. I knew Dick was scrambling. He was likely screaming at lawyers on the phone, trying to find a judge who would grant an emergency ex parte injunction to stop the crane. But the beautiful thing about the legal system is that it moves at the speed of molasses, especially for civil property disputes, and especially when the defendant is claiming federal preemption. No sane judge was going to sign a stop work order without at least holding a hearing, and there was no time to schedule a hearing before Tuesday morning. Tuesday dawned crisp and clear. The Idaho sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue, perfect weather for erecting 70 tons of steel. At exactly 7:30 a.m., the ground began to vibrate. It wasn't a subtle vibration. It felt like a minor earthquake. I stepped out onto my porch with my coffee just in time to see the convoy turning onto Oak Creek Drive. Big Mike hadn't just brought a crane. He had brought an armada. Leading the pack was Mike in his mud-splattered pickup truck with the amber lights flashing on the roof. Behind him was a massive multi-axle flatbed semi-truck carrying the disassembled sections of the lattice tower. The steel was pristine, galvanized, and gleaming in the morning sun. And behind the flatbed was the crane. It was a monstrous 90-ton mobile hydraulic crane, painted bright industrial yellow. It was so large it took up both lanes of the residential street, forcing cars parked on the side of the road to pull entirely onto the grass to avoid getting sideswiped by its massive outriggers. The noise was deafening. The hiss of air brakes, the roar of the diesel engines, the clanking of heavy chains. It was a symphony of malicious compliance. As the convoy crept toward my house, I saw Dick's front door fly open. He burst out of his house wearing a suit, a literal suit, and clutching a manila folder. He ran straight into the middle of the street and stood directly in the path of Big Mike's pickup truck, holding his hand up like a traffic cop. Mike hit the brakes. The flatbed behind him hissed to a stop. The massive crane idled loudly, the driver leaning out of the cab to see what the holdup was. I walked down my driveway to get a closer look. "You cannot enter!" Dick was screaming over the roar of the engines. "This is a private, restricted access neighborhood. Your vehicles exceed the gross tonnage limits for our asphalt. I am ordering you to turn around." Big Mike put his truck in park, rolled down his window, and rested his massive, tattooed arm on the doorframe. He looked down at Dick, like one might look at a particularly annoying, yapping chihuahua. "Morning, Richard," Mike said, his voice booming over the diesel rumble. "You're in the road." "I have filed for an emergency injunction," Dick yelled, waving his manila folder frantically. "The paperwork has been submitted to the Ada County Courthouse. You are operating in defiance of pending litigation." Mike chuckled. Pending litigation ain't a court order, buddy. Until a judge hands me a signed piece of paper telling me to stop, I've got a contract, a city permit, and a schedule to keep. Now move your body before I let the air horn do the talking." "I will not move," Dick shouted, planting his feet firmly on the asphalt, crossing his arms over his chest. "You will have to run me over." Mike sighed deeply. He didn't argue. He didn't yell. He just reached up to the ceiling of his cab and pulled a cord. The air horn on Big Mike's truck was the kind usually reserved for freight trains. The blast of sound was so loud, so physically concussive, that I actually felt it in my chest from 30 feet away. Dick literally leaped into the air. He scrambled backward, tripping over his own dress shoes, and fell hard onto the grassy median. His manila folder went flying, scattering legal documents across the pristine HOA landscaping. Mike casually put the truck back into drive and rolled slowly past Dick, turning into my driveway. The flatbed followed, the driver giving Dick a wide berth. Then came the crane. The operator had to expertly maneuver the massive machine, inching it backward into my yard so the boom could reach the concrete pad. It took them 2 hours just to set up. The crane's hydraulic outriggers extended like giant spider legs, pressing massive wooden mats into my lawn to distribute the weight. Dick stood on the sidewalk the entire time, his arms crossed, his face a mask of absolute, impotent fury. A crowd of neighbors had gathered. Some were whispering. Some were taking videos on their phones. By 10 a.m., the actual assembly began. The tower came in 3 30-foot sections, plus a 10-foot top cap, where the actual WISP transceivers would be mounted. I watched in absolute awe as Big Mike's crew rigged the first section with heavy nylon straps. The crane operator throttled up, the diesel engine whining, and the massive steel lattice lifted off the flatbed as if it weighed nothing. It swung gracefully through the air, casting a fleeting, terrifying shadow over Dick's house, before hovering directly over the concrete pad. Mike and 2 of his guys were waiting on the ground. They guided the massive steel base plates over the threaded anchor bolts we had set in the concrete days prior. With a heavy metallic clank, the first section touched down. They hit it with massive impact wrenches, securing the nuts with enough torque to withstand a hurricane. "First piece is down," Mike yelled to me, giving a thumbs up. Dick, who had now been joined by Martha and Gary from the board, stormed up to the edge of my property line. "This is an abomination," Martha cried out. "It's destroying the skyline." "It's just getting started, Martha," I called back cheerfully. The second section went up an hour later. Now the tower was 60 feet in the air. It towered over the 2-story houses. It was a monument of defiance, a soaring middle finger constructed of heavy-duty galvanized steel. As they prepared to lift the third section, a black sedan pulled up sharply to the curb. A man in a sharp gray suit stepped out, carrying a leather briefcase. He looked frantic. He rushed over to Dick, handed him a piece of paper, and then speed-walked toward me. "Are you the homeowner?" the lawyer asked, looking up at the crane with a mix of horror and disbelief. "I am," I said. "I am representing the Whispering Pines HOA," he said breathlessly, shoving a stack of stapled papers into my chest. "You have been served. This is a temporary restraining order issued by Judge Harrison of the Ada County Civil Division. All construction must cease immediately pending a full hearing." I took the papers. I looked at them. They looked official. There was a judge's signature. I looked up. The crane had already lifted the final 30-foot section of the tower. It was dangling 80 feet in the air, slowly rotating into position. "Mike!" I yelled over the noise. "Stop the lift! We've got a court order!" Mike signaled the crane operator. The operator locked the brakes. The massive piece of steel just hung there, suspended in the sky, exactly over the lower sections. Dick let out a triumphant bark of laughter. I told you you couldn't beat the covenants. You're finished. That monstrosity is coming down and you are going to pay for every second of this. I looked at the lawyer. When is the hearing? Tomorrow morning, 9 a.m., Department 4, the lawyer sneered. I highly suggest you bring representation, because we are going to seek maximum punitive damages. I looked up at the dangling piece of steel, then back at Dick's smug, radiant face. All right, Dick, I said calmly. I'll see you in court. I walked over to Mike. We have to stop for today. Court order. Mike looked at the papers, then looked up at the crane. I can't leave it dangling like that, boss. It's a safety hazard. I have to either set it down on the tower or bring it all the way back down to the truck. I smiled. Well, safety first, Mike. Best to secure it to the tower structure. Just don't bolt it in completely. We wouldn't want to violate the spirit of the stop work order. Mike grinned his gap-toothed smile. He signaled the operator. The final piece was gently lowered onto the rest of the tower. The crew threw a few temporary bolts through the flanges just to keep it from blowing away in the wind. But technically, construction had ceased. It stood 90 feet tall. It was breathtaking. That night I sat on my porch and just stared at it. The setting sun caught the steel, turning the entire structure a glowing, fiery orange. And just as I had calculated, at exactly 3:15 p.m., the sun hit the perfect angle, and a massive, cross-hatched shadow fell directly over Dick Sterling's house. It covered his manicured lawn. It blacked out his living room windows. It was a physical manifestation of his loss of control. The next morning, I drove to the Ada County Courthouse. I didn't hire a lawyer. When you have the federal government backing you on a technicality this specific, you don't need a lawyer. You just need to know how to read. I wore a nice suit, carried my trusted binder, and walked into Department 4 with the confidence of a man holding 4 aces. The courtroom was practically empty, save for Dick, his high-priced lawyer, and Martha, who had come along for moral support. They were sitting at the plaintiff's table, whispering furiously. Dick was practically vibrating with anticipation. He looked over at me and smirked, mouthing the words, "You're done." Judge Harrison emerged from his chambers. He was an older man, sporting a thick white mustache and an expression that suggested he was profoundly tired of dealing with petty neighbor disputes. He sat down, adjusted his glasses, and looked at the docket. "All right," Judge Harrison rumbled. "Whispering Pines Homeowners Association versus, well, the homeowner. This is a hearing regarding an emergency injunction and a temporary restraining order issued yesterday. Mr. Davis, you represent the HOA." Dick's lawyer stood up, buttoning his jacket. "Yes, Your Honor. We are seeking to make the injunction permanent, and we are requesting an immediate order for the demolition and removal of an unauthorized, unpermitted, and frankly dangerous industrial structure that the defendant has erected in his residential backyard. This structure is a blatant and egregious violation of the HOA's covenants, conditions, and restrictions, specifically Section 4 regarding exterior alterations." "I've read the brief, Mr. Davis," the judge said, flipping through a file. "You included photographs." "My God. Is that a broadcast tower?" "It is a 100-foot lattice steel abomination, Your Honor," Dick blurted out, unable to contain himself. "It is destroying the fabric of our community." "Mr. Sterling, let your counsel speak," the judge warned before turning his gaze to me. I was sitting alone at the defense table. "Sir, are you representing yourself?" "I am, Your Honor," I said, standing up. "Well, you've built quite the monument to yourself out there in Meridian," Judge Harrison noted dryly. "The plaintiff claims you bypassed the Architectural Review Board entirely. You understand that when you bought the house, you signed a contract agreeing to abide by those HOA rules, correct? I do, Your Honor, I said. And I would happily abide by them if they were legally enforceable in this specific context. Mr. Davis scoffed loudly. Your Honor, the defendant is attempting to use sovereign citizen tactics. He believes the rules do not apply to him. I'm not a sovereign citizen, I corrected him smoothly. I'm just a fan of federal administrative law. Your Honor, may I approach the bench to submit into evidence Defendant's Exhibit A? Proceed, the judge said. I walked up and handed the bailiff my binder. The bailiff passed it to the judge. Your Honor, I began, pacing slowly back to my table. The plaintiff is absolutely correct that my structure violates their 1998 bylaws regarding exterior antennas. However, what the plaintiff has willfully ignored is that the Whispering Pines bylaws are entirely preempted by federal law. Specifically, the Federal Communications Commission's Over-the-Air Reception Devices, or OTARD, rule. Mr. Davis stood up. Objection, Your Honor. OTARD applies to small consumer satellite dishes and basic TV antennas. The defendant has built a commercial-grade broadcast tower. The FCC rule does not protect industrial infrastructure in a residential zone. That was true, I countered, looking directly at Mr. Davis. Right up until January 7th, 2021. Your Honor, if you turn to tab 3 in the binder, you will find the official FCC report and order, document number FCC 21-10. In that order, the FCC explicitly expanded the OTARD protections to include hub and relay antennas used by fixed wireless internet service providers. Judge Harrison flipped to tab 3. He began reading silently, his eyebrows slowly creeping upward toward his hairline. Furthermore, Your Honor, I continued, my voice steady and clear in the quiet courtroom. If you turn to tab 4, you will find a fully executed commercial lease agreement between myself and Skylink Idaho, a registered WISP. My property is officially designated as a critical network relay node, intended to distribute broadband internet to the surrounding community. Under the 2021 OTARD revision, local governments and homeowners associations are strictly and explicitly prohibited from imposing any restrictions that unreasonably delay, prevent, or increase the cost of installing these specific relay structures. Dick was gripping the edge of his table. He's lying. He just wants to spite me because I fined him for a TV antenna. Relevance, Your Honor, I said. My motivations, petty as they may or may not be, do not alter federal preemption clauses. Judge Harrison looked up from the binder. He looked at Mr. Davis. Counselor, were you aware of this 2021 FCC revision? Mr. Davis looked like he had swallowed a lemon. He clearly had not done his homework. He had assumed this was a standard slam-dunk HOA violation case. Your Honor, we argue that a 100-foot tower still constitutes an unreasonable safety hazard, which the FCC rule allows HOAs to regulate. Ah, safety, I said, smiling. Your Honor, tab 5. The fully stamped approved structural engineering and zoning permits from the city of Meridian. The city building inspector reviewed the plans. The concrete footing was poured to commercial safety standards. The structure is well under the FAA's 200-foot limit. The city found no safety hazards and issued the permit. The HOA has zero legal standing to claim a safety violation when the municipal authority has already cleared it. The courtroom was dead silent. All you could hear was the rustling of paper as Judge Harrison flipped through my meticulously organized binder. He looked at the city permits. He looked at the WISP lease. He read the FCC order again. He closed the binder and leaned back in his chair. He looked at Dick. Mr. Sterling, the judge said, his voice heavy with finality. Your HOA covenants are a contract, but federal law is the law of the land. When the two conflict, the federal government wins. Every single time. Dick stood up, his face pale, his voice trembling. Your Honor, you can't be serious. Look at the pictures. It's a monstrosity. It drops a shadow over my entire house. It's going to ruin my property values. If you have an issue with the FCC's rulings regarding telecommunications infrastructure, Mr. Sterling, I suggest you write a letter to your congressman, Judge Harrison said bluntly. But this court has absolutely no jurisdiction to overrule a federal administrative order, nor do I have the authority to enforce an HOA covenant that is in direct, documented conflict with the FCC. This injunction was issued in error. The judge picked up his gavel. The temporary restraining order is dissolved immediately. The plaintiff's request for a permanent injunction is denied. Case dismissed with prejudice. And Mr. Davis, the judge added, glaring at the lawyer, next time you file an emergency ex parte motion, I highly suggest you check the current federal statutes first. Court is adjourned. Smack. The gavel came down. It was the sweetest sound I had ever heard. Dick collapsed into his chair. He literally deflated. Martha looked like she was about to cry. Mr. Davis frantically started shoving his papers into his briefcase, avoiding eye contact with everyone. I walked over to the plaintiff's table. I leaned down, resting my hands on the polished wood, and looked Dick right in the eye. "Hey, Dick," I said softly. He slowly looked up at me. His eyes were hollow. "You should probably check your mail today," I whispered. "Skylink is sending out the promotional flyers for the new gigabit internet service. I hear the coverage is really strong on your side of the street." I didn't wait for a response. I turned and walked out of the courtroom, my heels clicking on the marble floor. By noon that same day, Big Mike and his crew were back at my house. Because the temporary restraining order had been legally dissolved, they were free to finish the job. Mike's guys climbed the tower, locked down the heavy steel bolts on the top section, and installed the massive flat-panel transceivers for the WISP network. They ran the heavy coaxial cables down the spine of the tower and connected them to the power grid. By 4 p.m., the Skylink engineers arrived in a white van. They booted up the system. I was sitting in my living room with my laptop. I pulled up a speed test. Ping. 12 mms. Download 1.2 Gbps. Upload 850 Mbps. It was the fastest, most stable internet connection I had ever seen. And it was completely, entirely, 100% federally protected. The fallout in the neighborhood was instantaneous. By Thursday, word had spread about the court case. The residents of Whispering Pines realized two things very quickly. 1, Dick Sterling was not an untouchable god. And 2, the new internet service was phenomenal. People started dropping their overpriced, monopolistic cable providers in droves. Skylink trucks were in the neighborhood every single day, installing small receiver dishes on people's roofs, which, ironically, were also protected by the exact same FCC OTARD rule. Dick tried to fine people for the new receiver dishes, but nobody paid them. They knew the law now. The illusion of his power was completely shattered. Gary, the terrified board member, resigned a week later. Martha tried to hold on to her authority, but at the next monthly HOA meeting, a coalition of angry neighbors essentially staged a coup, demanding a total overhaul of the CC&Rs and threatening to recall the entire board. Dick became a ghost. He stopped walking the neighborhood with his iron clipboard. He stopped measuring the grass. He stopped harassing the garbage men. Which brings us back to today. I'm sitting on my porch, enjoying the crisp autumn air. I've got my laptop open, streaming a 4K movie without a single second of buffering. I look across the street. Dick is in his front yard. He's holding a tape measure, staring blankly at a patch of his Kentucky bluegrass. He looks old. He looks defeated. I glance at my watch. It's 3:14 p.m. I watch the sun inch its way across the Idaho sky. I watch the massive geometric shadow of my 100-foot, FCC-protected, legally invincible broadcast tower crawl across the asphalt of Oak Creek Drive. It slides over the curb. It creeps up Dick's driveway. At exactly 3:15 p.m., the shadow hits him. It covers him in shade. It plunges his pristine bay windows into darkness. He drops the tape measure. He doesn't look up at the tower. He doesn't look over at me. He just turns around, walks slowly back inside his house, and shuts the door. I take a sip of my iced tea. The rules are the rules, after all. And honestly, I think the aesthetics of the neighborhood have never looked better.